The advent of the internal combustion engine changed the face of 20th century warfare forever. In World War II, machines dominated the battlefield. According to American Allied Commander General Eisenhower, 4 machines played a decisive role in Europe and the Pacific. None of them was a weapon. In the air, the C47 transported everything from arms and ammunition to commanders and paratroopers wherever the Allies needed them. At sea, the landing craft delivered Allied soldiers to the beaches of Europe and Asia. There was no other way the Axis powers of Germany, Japan and Italy could be defeated. On land, the 2.5-ton truck carried supplies to the Allied armies on every continent, making sure the war effort kept moving. And the Bulldozer opened the way for the advancing Allied forces. This is the story of these 4 war-winning machines. These are soldiers of the British Royal Marines, practicing a beach attack on a cold winter's morning. Their assault landing craft are a direct descendant of those used in the Second World War.
Prepare to be!
Without them, it would be impossible to land troops on a hostile shore. During the war, landing craft were at the heart of the Allied strategy. The only way back into occupied Europe or across the Japanese-held islands of the Pacific was over the beaches.
On troops!
Crossing the strip of water between ship and shore is one of the most dangerous operations in modern warfare. But in June 1944, the Allies had no alternative.
It's not possible to think of D-Day without thinking of landing craft. It couldn't possibly have been done. You could bring in a platoon of riflemen, you could bring in tanks, you could bring in trucks, you could bring in artillery, you could bring all that heavy stuff ashore on landing craft. You didn't need a harbor. This was the single biggest surprise to the Germans on D-Day. They assumed the Allies are going to have to attack a harbor. They can't possibly support even 1 division, much less 5, much less 50, over an open beach. Well, in fact, in June and July, we got to the point that we were supporting 50 divisions from the LSTs and the other landing craft on the open beach.
Over 3,500 landing craft were used on D-Day. But remarkably, at the start of World War II, neither Britain nor America had seriously considered the need for them. That need became all too obvious after Dunkirk, when the British forces had been evacuated from France.
Well, the Brits were more interested than the Americans were because they'd been kicked off the continent in the spring of 1940 and were anticipating having to get back on. You needed some craft to do it with. This was the thing that stopped Hitler from invading England. He didn't have any landing craft. He was talking about towing men over in barges. With the RAF overhead and with the Royal Navy coming down from Scapa Flow.
During the war, both American and British shipyards began producing a whole family of landing craft for use in the Pacific and European theatres. They ranged from small assault craft that could carry around 30 soldiers, tank landing craft, or LCTs, larger infantry landing craft, LCIs, that could bring in up to 200 troops, right up to the landing ship tanks, the LSTs. Although the British built some of these craft, the shortage of raw materials, particularly steel, meant that most were built in the United States and were shipped over the Atlantic. One man in particular, Andrew Higgins of New Orleans, was responsible for producing many of the landing craft that the Allies used during World War II.
Andy Higgins is at the center of the story of landing craft. He was a small boat builder in South Louisiana in 1939 who saw an opportunity and seized it in a way that is just remarkable. He went from a plant with about 80 employees at the beginning of the war to a plant with 20,000 employees at the end of the war. He turned out 20,000 landing craft in the course of the war, all of his own design. The backbone of the landing craft fleet was the landing craft vehicle personnel, the Higgins boat. 36 foot long, carry 30 armed men, get them ashore, drop that ramp, they could exit in 19 seconds.
Graham Haddock and Mac McDarby both worked for Andrew Higgins during the war. Today, they're helping to rebuild an LCVP for the New Orleans D-Day Museum.
The Higgins boats were a success as a landing craft because they had been developed over the years in similar work as workboats. Now, these boats had been used all over the world in the most unlikely places, in remote areas where repairs and maintenance and support were rare, and they had to be 100% dependable. The basic boat that was able to go through shallow water, over sandbars, through obstacles, they were extremely ruggedly built so that they could stand a pounding on the bottom or banging against the side of ships. They had an excess of power that the other boats that had been proposed did not have. So the darn boats were just brutes, and they were able to do the job.
The LCVP was just one of the Higgins boats. He also built tank landing craft, or LCTs, motor torpedo boats, and a host of other ships for the Allies. So successful were his boats that he was awarded the largest shipbuilding contract in history. Even Hitler referred to him as the new Noah.
It was very busy, and there was an air in the plant that everybody had to do their little bit, their part in the war effort. He had these signs up all over the place. The man who relaxes is helping the Axis.
By June the 5th, 1944, the Allies had assembled an enormous fleet along Britain's southern coast, mainly in the protected waters of the Solent, between Portsmouth and the Isle of Wight. This was Operation Neptune, the naval part of the invasion of Normandy. Over 5,000 vessels, from landing craft to battleships, were to take part in the biggest amphibious assault the world had ever seen. As the sun set on the evening of June the 5th, the Allied fleet set sail across the Channel. It had one purpose: to land 5 divisions of soldiers on the shores of France, and so create a beachhead for the invasion of occupied Europe. At dawn on June the 6th, the invasion of Normandy began. Hundreds of naval guns began a sustained bombardment of the coast. Soon, the troops on board the first landing craft would face the toughest journey of their lives. Up to 11 kilometers across rough seas, under constant enemy fire. Their craft were flimsy and vulnerable, not built for defense or attack, only for the vital task of getting them to the beaches. It was an experience no one taking part would ever forget. Private Jim Cartwright was in the first assault on Sword Beach.
I don't think anyone spoke until we hit the beach. Everyone had thoughts of their own. My thoughts were, how long am I going to last? And I think the thought was in everyone's mind.
Wave after wave of landing craft headed for the 5 designated beaches. Because of their flat bottoms and square bows, they were uncomfortable boats to sail in. The rough seas made the journey worse. Many of the soldiers and seamen were seasick. Donald McPherson crewed an LCM.
The troops I spoke to, all that they wanted to do was to get ashore. Anything to get off of that bloody craft. You know, they didn't mind basing the Germans, provided they could get off that craft to do it, you know. They hated the landing craft.
You got that feeling, you wouldn't care if you died with being sick all the time. But once we got out of the craft, we were okay.
Despite the naval bombardment, as the landing craft approached the shore, they came under heavy fire from the German defences. There was little protection for the troops inside.
When we got close to shore, the shells were bursting around the craft. Some of the craft either side of us were hit, and shells were dropping on the shore. Machine guns were firing. Mortar shells were dropping from the houses, and it was really frightening.
Les Perry was a signaller for the South Lancs Regiment going into Sword Beach.
You hear these stories about they went in singing and all the rest of it, a load of old cobblers. We were bloody scared, I tell you.
Slim Wildman went into Sword Beach with the amphibious tanks.
You were scared. If anybody said they weren't scared, then they're just telling bloody lies. The fact that we'd been told beforehand that the 27th Armoured Brigade was an expendable brigade, and they did reckon we'd have 75% casualties in the first 48 hours. No, we were scared and wondered what was going to happen.
As well as fierce enemy shelling, the beaches were protected by hundreds of obstacles, built to cripple landing craft as they reached the shore. Bob Hare was a coxswain on an LCA.
Going ashore was quite difficult in as much as trying to avoid these hedgehogs, as they were called, that had these anti-personnel mines on them. You touched them, they blew up.
There was all stakes set in the sand with shells and mines lashed to the top of them. And the coxswain of the landing craft were weaving around these stakes to get in. And they were great. I mean, we couldn't praise them enough, because without them, we couldn't have possibly got ashore.
Unfortunately, I hit one of these underwater obstacles, and it just ripped the bottom of the boat out, and the boat just went down like a lead weight. Fortunately, we all got off, and we all got onto another boat, going back to our own ship.
When we hit the beach, there was landing craft turned over. Some have had their bows blown off. Some have been holed. They was wallowing about. There was dead bodies wallowing about in the sea.
I was best to describe it as being inside of a box, an iron box, and it's not a comfortable feeling. And then when the ramp goes down and you're so fully exposed, it's even less of a comfortable feeling. That's when fear really hit. That's where a lot of men were killed as the ramp came down on the smaller craft.
You can't explain it. You know, you're going in, you're going down that ramp, and you think to yourself, Christ, if one of these bullets hit me, I'm gone.
If a man went down, you weren't allowed to stop and see to him. You had to leave him. Even if a man was writhing in agony, you weren't to stop and tend to him.
The human cost of the seaborne invasion was high. The Allies took nearly 5,000 casualties on D-Day.
There was a couple of men who were on their knees, and we thought, what the hell? You know, what they do is kneeling there saying their prayers. But they weren't. They'd been cut through with the German machine guns, and they'd gone down on their knees holding their stomach, and that's how they'd died.
We saw the chaos, we saw the slaughter, and we saw them getting killed right and left, some drowning in the water, so on.
I'd never seen our soldiers dead. I had seen one or two dead, but not like they were on the beach when they were floating about the surf. That sticks in my memory, and I didn't like it one little bit. As a young boy of 19, it was not very nice. Not very nice at all.
One of the worst aspects of taking landing craft into the beach, is certainly after the main assaults, was the amount of dead bodies in the water. You had no option. You were running over these, you know, the craft was sweeping them aside, and there were loads of them. Soldiers, sailors, all sorts. You see these films of soldiers running up the beach away from their landing craft, but everybody forgets that landing craft has got to go back and get another load. So if you didn't get it the first time in, the chances were you were going to be hit the second or the third time.
By the end of D-Day, 3,500 landing craft had put over 150,000 men and 50,000 vehicles ashore on the Normandy coast. The Allies had their foothold in France. It was a stunning achievement of man and machine.
The first time I met Dwight Eisenhower, it was 1964. He had asked me up to Gettysburg to talk about being his biographer. And he said at the end of the day, now I notice that you're from New Orleans. Did you know Andy Higgins? Well, no, sir, I said. He died the year before I moved to New Orleans. And Eisenhower said, well, that's too bad. He's the man who won the war for us. And my jaw just dropped. I mean, that's quite a statement from quite a source. And he saw my astonishment and went on to assure me that that's absolutely right. If Andy Higgins hadn't designed and built those LCVPs, which came to be known as the Higgins boats, We never could have gone in over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have changed. So thank God for Andy Higgins.
In the 1930s, the US Army was tiny, barely 160,000 officers and men. The horse and cart had only just been retired from service, and the only trucks they had were left over from the First World War. They badly needed replacing. In 1938, the Quartermaster Corps approached the automobile industry with their requirements. They wanted a utility truck that was simple to maintain, could carry a decent load, and most important of all, a truck that could be built like a car on a production line. General Motors put in the cheapest quote and won the contract. 2 years later, they'd built 40,000 2.5-ton trucks. By 1942, 15,000 trucks a month were rolling off the production lines. When America entered the war, Hitler had not reckoned on the power of Detroit. By the end of the war, over 500,000 so-called deuce and a halves had been delivered to the Allied armies.
Now, the deuce and a half was the best truck of the war, by far. Wonderfully reliable, very rugged, could carry a pile of men.
It was a nice truck, very nice truck, a very nice piece of equipment. I wouldn't mind having one now. I could make a living off of it.
One of the secrets of why this truck worked out so well was the engine in here. It was just a basic overhead valve 6-cylinder car engine. It was simple to build, it was cheap to build, seldomly broke down. When it did break down, anybody could fix it. Had absolutely no sophistication, which was probably its most redeeming quality. The whole truck's about as simple as a brick to take care of. The truck was such a reliable chassis. Initially, it was just ordered as a standard cargo truck, figuring that everybody would just ride in the thing, but the trucks proved so useful, it ended up everybody used it for everything. It was just one of those sort of a Cinderella machine that appeared out of nowhere and proved to be that if it wasn't for this truck, that nothing would have moved into World War II.
The deuce and a half was everywhere, but its finest hour came after the Allied breakout from Normandy. The First and Third Armies began a relentless pursuit of the retreating German forces. But to keep going, they needed fuel, food, and ammunition. The major Channel ports were still under German control, and all the Allied supplies had to be brought in over the beach. The 2.5-ton truck was to bear the brunt of the transport job.
These trucks would pick up their goods, whether it was ammunition or medical supplies or clothing or rations or whatever, and run them in a one-way only road, just continuous, conveyor belt kind of a thing, up to the front lines.
That one-way road was known as the Red Ball Express.
In order to demonstrate how important and how fast the cargo had to go through, the Army adopted a rail term, Red Ball Express, which meant high-priority express cargo. Now, in order to identify the route, the signs, they put red balls all along the route, they put them on the trucks, and they even put them on the military police that were supposed to, and the helmets of the military police directing the traffic, to show everyone where the route was and how important it was and what was being used to control it.
The Red Ball Express began on August the 25th, 1944, when 5,500 trucks, most of them deuce and a halves, began hauling supplies and equipment to General Patton's Third Army. It was a one-way circular route, taking supplies to the front line.
The 2.5-ton truck was exceedingly important because it filled in where it really didn't belong, and that's where it did such an incredible job. The transportation planners at Normandy wanted line haul trucks, tractor trailers, 17 and 10-ton tractor trailers that were designed to do the kind of job that was supposed to be done on the Red Ball Express. But they didn't have them, and so they had to take the 2.5-ton truck and use it as a substitute. And that's where I think that the deuce and a half, as it was called, did such a fantastic job.
Over 25,000 men took part in the Red Ball Express. In the still segregated US Army, most of the transport battalion's drivers were African Americans.
I can't remember a speed limit. If it was a speed limit, I would say it'd be about 30, 35 miles an hour. But when you're hauling parts up to the front, that speed limit didn't mean nothing. Once General Patton said he wanted something, that was it. He didn't care nothing about speed limit, nobody. He was just war, war, war.
Well, they didn't really tell us anything. We just knew what to do was drive. Drive, drive, drive. Sometimes you have to drive, you couldn't stop to relieve yourself. You had to relieve yourself the best way you could, and then you would keep rolling.
Patton's advance consumed supplies at a ferocious rate, particularly gasoline for his tanks. At the peak of the Red Ball operation, over 12,000 tons of material was moved to the front each day. It was an enormous strain on the trucks.
Oh yeah, they were overloaded, and they had quite a few accidents like that. They turned over. But the Army didn't care. They didn't care. If you turned over, a wrecker would come behind, straighten you up, leave whatever fell on the ground. They would call in, another empty truck coming, and pick it up. They did that quite a bit.
Red Ball was a 24-hour operation, and driving at night, under blackout conditions, was by far the most dangerous time.
They had on the truck what you call cat eyes, which wasn't very big. In fact, they were smaller than ordinary cat's eye. But that's what you had to drive by at night. You had to follow the truck in front of you. If the truck in front of you went off a cliff, you were going right behind it. So you better hope that the driver in front of you can see the road. And it was scary at night. It wasn't no fun. I remember one time we drove all day into the night. We didn't stop. We had to switch drivers while we were driving. Therefore, the truck kept going. But that was dangerous.
The Red Ball Express was a remarkable trucking achievement, but not all the supplies reached the people they were intended for.
Gasoline on the black market was very expensive. It was about $20 a gallon. And when you consider that an American soldier made $21 a month, it meant that a 5-gallon can with the can was about 6 months' pay. And without a lot of supervision, there was a lot of trading on the black market.
They didn't have a tally sheet of what each truck had, how many gallons of gas or how many boxes of ammunition we had or clothing, so they wouldn't miss it. You had no inventory there.
One instance happened, these fellows were selling Army supplies to the civilians, food, guns. I knew a fellow that sold a whole truck.
I was always on the lookout for a Jeep that was either hit a mine and it was destroyed and it was left abandoned, and I would bring that abandoned Jeep on a hook and bring it back to the company area for my company to rebuild the Jeep. At the end of the war, we sold these Jeeps on the black market. We were, let's say, Sergeant Bilko.
After 81 days, the Red Ball Express was wound up. By November 1944, the French railway system was becoming operational, and the Channel ports were captured. "The truck," said General Patton, "is our most useful weapon." The Red Ball Express had demonstrated just what he meant. These are modern military bulldozers, Caterpillar D7s. They are perhaps one of the least glamorous machines in the military inventory, but they're also one of the most important. Military engineers describe their role as mobility, counter-mobility, survivability, and sustainment. Every one of these missions needs a bulldozer. General Patton, when asked to choose between a bulldozer and a tank for an invasion, said, "Give me the road-building equipment every time."
They call this an engineer war. They call the bulldozer America's secret weapon. Soldier named Montgomery, English soldier. Said you could do everything with a bulldozer but shave with it. This little baby has plenty of big brothers doing plenty of odd jobs.
It seemed indestructible. A blow torch or a cutting torch is the only way it could be dismantled.
It was an important machine. Without it, I don't think we could have won the war.
During World War II, the Bulldozer became known as the boss of the beach. They were involved in every invasion, from the Pacific to Normandy, and often they were among the first vehicles to come ashore. They cleared the beachheads, built roads and airfields, and pushed a way through the rubble-strewn streets. They were wanted everywhere, by everyone. Surprisingly, though, it was a machine that was never intended for the military.
Well, the bulldozer, or the crawler tractor as it was known, came into its own during the Great Depression of the 1930s here in the United States. It was used by the agriculturalists in the Great Plains to break up the soil, to put into agricultural duty. All of a sudden, in World War II, 15,000 of these were needed and procured by the Army and put into service all around the world in military duty. Bulldozers had a very important role on the battlefields of Europe, and particularly in the Pacific theater, in doing the mundane tasks of construction.
In the Pacific Campaign, American strategy was shaped by the ocean's vast distances. The only way to get back at the Japanese was to advance island by island until Allied forces were close enough to bomb and then invade Japan itself. Each island first had to be seized from a fanatical enemy. Only then could it be used as a staging post across the Pacific. The men whose thankless job it was to turn a shattered island into the next jumping-off point for the advance were the engineers of the United States Navy's construction battalions, the famous Seabees.
Seabees' motto was "can do," and our commander said if it's possible, we'll do it right now. If it's impossible, it'll take a little longer.
The Seabees had been formed in 1942 as the military urgently required base and airfield construction in the Pacific Theater. Most of the men were drawn from civilian construction specialists, and while the average age of a Marine was 19, that of the Seabees was 34.
General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz, having now achieved the first large-scale merging of their forces in the Central and South Pacific, focused their attention on Bougainville in the Solomon Islands. Here, 22,000 Japanese troops are cut off from further supplies.
The Bougainville operation was typical of the island-hopping campaign. The Seabees went in with the Marines to start work on the airstrip.
We first arrived at Bougainville from out at sea a few miles. It was like an island paradise. The trees were in full view, reaching the skyline, and the ocean was calm. But as we got closer, we heard the planes, enemy planes above as well as ours. The noise of the bombs going off, the whole environment changed. And it was just like you were coming out of a grave and seeing all this going on. It was just miserable.
There was nothing there except jungle. Navy had shelled the beach. We had to clear all that off, debris, push it off in a spoil bank, and then haul in to fill dirt in order to build a runway.
Ground conditions were terrible, mainly jungle and swamp. The Seabees had only a few weeks to build an airstrip. This is where the Bulldozer came into its own. Its first job was to clear the jungle.
To see them push over trees 60 and 70 feet in the air and stay clear of them when they fell, and not to push them over on another operator was just a joy to watch. And that all had to be moved and the dirt taken off of them. And it was all wet dirt, so it was hard to shake it off. And the operators would push it all on a pile on the side.
To build the runways, the Seabees had to use whatever materials they could find locally. Two things were in abundant supply: sand and coral.
And after they brought it up to grade where they could bring in the coral and some of the sand to mix it together to make a hard surface.
The coral worked real good, and it made a good feel. And if you kept it damp, it's almost like concrete. But you had to keep it damp all the time. We'd run water trucks and keep enough salt water on it to keep it in a damp condition.
When the coral and sand base was level, the Seabees laid preformed metal sheets, called pierce planking, down on the strip. It was grueling work. The men worked 8 hours on, 8 hours off, and the living conditions were primitive.
When we first landed in Bougainville, it was scary. None of us had experienced being away from home, as well as invading an island where there was nothing but natives, trees, bugs, mosquitoes, and living conditions were terrible.
At Bougainville, when I had dysentery at nighttime, you lived in a foxhole and you didn't have any password. You stayed in your foxhole all night and used our helmet for everything. And you wasn't allowed out of your foxhole at nighttime because anything above the ground you got shot.
The Seabees were building the airfield as the fighting continued around them. It took 6 weeks to finish the airfield, but considerably longer to clear the island of Japanese troops.
One of the natives made a statement that the Japanese came in, pushed them back in the jungle, and the Marines came along and pushed the Japs in the jungle, and the Seabees came along and no more jungle.
The Bulldozer was one of the most important pieces of equipment that ever hit the beachhead. Once it landed and the smoke would come out of the exhaust and the trees started falling, we felt we were going to be home soon.
The DC-3 is one of the most successful and best-loved aeroplanes ever built. This aircraft, 41 Hotel Quebec, was the first DC-3 to enter military service in 1938. It belonged to General Hap Arnold, the father of the United States Air Force. Today, it's been lovingly restored and is owned and operated by Spunkmeyer Air in California. She's on one of her regular passenger flights around the Bay Area of San Francisco. Over 10,000 DC-3s were built by the Douglas Company between 1935 and the end of the war, and more than 1,000 of them are still flying today.
Great airplane. Never met a pilot who flew it who didn't think it was a fine airplane.
You always felt that whatever happened to you, the airplane was your friend, that the airplane would do anything that you asked of it.
The fighter pilots named him the Goody Bird because that was the most awkward bird known to man. Of course, we troop carrier pilots, we didn't like that nickname at all.
The DC-3 was originally designed as a passenger plane, the first to fly a non-stop sleeper service between the east and west coast. But by the time the war broke out, the military had realized what a useful aircraft it was, and began ordering them in their thousands. The military version was known as the C47, or Dakota. Captain Stu Carson is a retired airline pilot, but he started off his flying career on the DC-3.
They still are my favorite airplane. You won't find a commercial pilot anyplace who wouldn't just tear the door down to get to fly this airplane. Its basic design was so many years ahead of itself. Up to the recent past, there hasn't been anything that even comes close to it for reliability. The airplane itself was quite a bit over-designed and probably could have been designed lighter and flown faster, but it wouldn't have lasted as long. I don't know right now of any airline that could ever look back and say that they had a structural problem with this airplane. It is probably the most honest airplane that I've ever had my hands on, and dependable and a success in every way. If I could meet the designer of this airplane and Donald Douglas himself, I would tell him that they designed the most successful aircraft in the whole world.
In World War II, the C-47 was the workhorse of the skies. One of its main jobs was supplying Allied troops from the air. That job came no tougher than in the Burma campaign. Here, the Dakota supplied one of the most remarkable actions of the war. 3,000 British and Gurkha troops penetrated deep behind the Japanese lines. For 3 months, the Chindits, as they were called, moved through the jungle, waging a guerrilla-style war against the enemy. Everything they needed had to be delivered by air. Without regular drops from the Dakotas, the Chindits could never have survived. Derek Grucock was one of the pilots.
For the Chindits, we would fly in food, ammunition, boots, mail. We even flew in Mariah Teresa dollars, so that they could, if they wanted help from the local tribesmen, they would be able to pay for it. And when we flew them in, we also flew in mules, which they used for transport. Wonderful things, mules, as any soldier will tell you. And we flew in oxen, which they also used initially for transport and then for food.
The Chindits were operating in mountainous terrain. It made finding the dropping zone, or DZ, a problem.
Well, basically, that there is very little in the way of any sort of navigation aids at all. It's a matter of map reading, and you can't map read very much because there's not much to read down there because it's all jungle and a few rivers. Well, having located the DZ, or what you hoped was the DZ, you would fly over the top, look down and make sure it had all the correct identification there, and you weren't dropping to somebody else. And you would then fly around and work out your circuit, which would be at about 800 to 1,000 feet, and then you would warn the people in the back who'd already got everything lined up at the door. It was all a matter of, skill in the head, no calculation. You would then press the red button just before, then when you wanted them to let go, press the green button, and then they'd push it all out. And the chap who really had to work were the boys in the back doing that pushing. They were being buffeted all over the place by the rough air. They were having to handle these containers, which are pretty heavy. And as soon as you wanted them to stop, you press the red button again, and they'd stop pushing out, and your then immediate reaction was to turn right round, put your head out the window, and the stuff would still be falling, and you'd see whether you'd got a good estimate of the wind or not. When people on the ground who were depending on it saw it coming, they heaved a sigh of relief and knew, boy, now we can eat, and now we can return fire because we've got more ammunition, and thank God for the Dakota. And the Dakota was, I think, the only aeroplane I know in the world at that time that could have done the job.
The C-47 saw service in every theatre of the war. General Eisenhower used one as his own transport, but it was as a troop carrier that it contributed to the Allied victory. In the closing months of the war, the Allies needed to cross the Rhine in Germany. They conceived Operation Varsity to do it.
Operation Varsity was the greatest airborne assault of all time, although it's hardly known. Everybody knows about D-Day. Everybody knows about Arnhem and the Bridge Too Far. Almost nobody knows anything about Varsity, but there were more men, more planes, more gliders, more paratroopers involved in Varsity than any other air operation in history.
In Operation Varsity, 2 airborne divisions, the American 17th and the British 6th, were to drop behind the German lines to secure the Rhine crossing. 1,700 transport aircraft were involved. Many of these towed gliders carrying extra troops. 900 fighter aircraft kept air cover. On March the 24th, 1945, the largest air armada in history took off from bases in Britain and France. For many British paratroopers, Varsity was the first operation they'd flown in a Dakota.
Compared with D-Day, where we jumped through a hole in the floor from a Sterling, the Dakota was indeed a luxury. It was like getting into a very comfortable bus, very posh. We all liked the Dakota, and it was quite an easy aircraft to jump out of.
Well, on the way over, I immediately fell asleep when because we'd somewhat partied the night before. As we approached the Rhine River, my buddy beside me poked me and said, "There's the Rhine." The ground was almost in complete shadow because of the aircraft in the air. There were that many.
Gordie Wood flew a C-47 on Varsity.
And there were airplanes all over. There were airplanes to the right of you, in front of you. There were just a mass and mass of airplanes.
British civilians had seen the air armadas take off for D-Day, seen them take off for the Arnhem operation, market garden. They saw them take off in even greater numbers for varsity. And then the people of Holland who saw them pass over talk about this dark cloud. And then the Germans who were on the far side were just, they looked up and oh mein Gott. The sky was absolutely filled with planes and none of them were theirs.
Jack Cardwell was another C-47 pilot who flew the mission.
Well, as you approached the drop zone and you had the red light on that the paratroopers were watching and the jump master was at the rear and he telling everybody just what to do, and they were very anxious.
The paratroopers would then, their command was stand up and hook up. And they stood up and got in their proper line, the 16 or 18 of them lined up. They hooked up their static line to a cable that ran from the cockpit down just past the door.
There were aircraft puffs all around us, and I heard the tinkling of shrapnel along the fuselage. And then I was all saying to myself, for heaven's sake, get those lights on. I was raring to go to get the hell out of it.
Major Smith's airplane caught on fire on the left engine right away. As he approached the drop zone, he held right to his course to that drop zone. The paratroopers were jumping out through the flames that were coming back from that engine.
I got myself to the door, both hands gripping the edge of the door, with my left foot on the lip of the door, and then I was able to see much clearer the scene outside. One just looked out of the door and saw all these aircraft, all these Dakotas around, flying with you. And suddenly the green light came and I was out like a flash, and everyone else followed me in double quick time. You jump out into space and there's a wonderful rush of wind and slipstream around your body. And looking up over your head you can see your chute developing. And then suddenly there's a little crack and it's fully developed and you're floating down quietly.
You saw nothing but parachutes. Thousands of parachutes, just thousands of them, literally. Because I was one of the first one. I was actually the third person in the first airplane, having been a Pathfinder. As I'm on the ground, I'm looking up and I'm seeing thousands and thousands of parachutes. And all these C-47s just flying away, and the other aircraft, the fighter aircraft buzzing around, the dive bombers buzzing around. An awesome sight, awesome sight.
And then gliders start cutting loose, and they're coming down, and they see paratroopers coming down on them. And meanwhile, the P-51s and the P-47s are strafing them and dropping 500-pound bombs on them. And the big bombers overhead, a little further inland on their artillery, are dropping the big blockbuster bombs, the ton bombs that are gone to there. And it was just a cataclysm of firepower.
Next, the glider troops. The pilot releases the tow rope and the sailplane zooms to a landing.
These Horsa gliders would nose down and come straight down like an arrow, like they were going to plow that thing right into the ground. Then haul up on the yoke. The thing will come up in a semi-stall and pancake in. And these British guys come out with all guns firing. Oh man, it was an awesome scene because I'm laying there, my buttons are in the way of getting closer to the ground. And these guys are just blazing away with everything they got.
By the end of the first day, the airborne troops had taken 3,500 prisoners. Within 3 days, the Allies had secured the Rhine. Operation Varsity had been a stunning success. But without the C-47, it wouldn't have been possible.
Well, I liked the C-47 in particular. It brought me through almost 3 years of operational flying in Europe, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, Germany, in a variety of situations, carrying all kinds of loads, from gasoline to toilet paper to wounded to you name it, and I'm here.
50 years on, 2 of those varsity pilots are getting the chance to fly the DC-3 again.
Well, welcome aboard, gentlemen. Welcome to the 1940s.
back to the barn. I mean, after all these years, to get up there and within minutes feel comfortable again, it's just phenomenal. It's like the old bicycle thing. You ride the bicycle and you never forget how. Greatest airplane. I cannot imagine an airplane that has more to offer for a longer period of time than the DC-3 C-47. Just phenomenal.
Well, I hadn't flown a C-47 since 1945. To get back in the cockpit again was always one of the greatest sensations that you can imagine.
I was looking across the cockpit at dreamers. They were just sitting there reliving the past. There was nothing but delight on their faces.
I loved every second of it and just wished in the worst way I could have another flight someday in the good old C-47. I think they'll be around a lot longer than I will.
Machines played a decisive role in World War II, the first truly mechanized war in history. And for the Allies at least, the C-47, the 2.5-ton truck, the landing craft, and the Bulldozer were the unsung heroes. As Eisenhower said afterwards, without them, the Allies could not have won the war.
Coming next, our battlefield documentary concludes the tragic story of Operation Market Garden, whose failure cost thousands of Allied lives.